The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, commonly referred to as Soviet Ukraine or simply as Ukraine, was a Soviet socialist state and one of the constituent republics of the Soviet Union from its inception in 1922 to its breakup in 1991. The Ukrainian SSR was a founding member of the United Nations, although it was legally represented by the All-Union state in its affairs with countries outside of the Soviet Union. Upon the Soviet Union's dissolution and perestroika, the Ukrainian SSR was transformed into the modern nation-state and renamed itself to the Republic of Ukraine, although Ukraine's new constitution was only ratified on the 28th of June 1996. Throughout its 72-year history, the republic's borders changed many times, with a significant portion of what is now Western Ukraine being annexed by Soviet forces in 1939 from the Republic of Poland, and the addition of Russian Crimea in 1954. From the start, the eastern city of Kharkov served as the republic's capital. However, in 1934, the seat of government was subsequently moved to the city of Kiev, which remained the capital of newly independent Ukraine. Geographically, the Ukrainian SSR was situated in Eastern Europe, to the north of the Black Sea, bordered by the Soviet republics of Moldavia, Belarus, and the Russian SFSR. The Ukrainian SSR's border with Czechoslovakia formed the Soviet Union's westernmost border point. According to the Soviet census of 1989, the republic had a population of 51,706,746 inhabitants, which fell sharply after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Name: after the abdication of the Tsar and the start of the process of the destruction of the Russian Empire, many people in Ukraine wished to establish a Ukrainian Republic. During a period of civil war from 1917 to 23, many factions claiming themselves governments of the newly born republic were formed, each with supporters and opponents. The two most prominent of them were the government in Kiev and the government in Kharkiv, the former being the Ukrainian People's Republic and the latter the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. The former was internationally recognized and supported by the Central Powers following the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, whereas the latter was solely supported by Soviet Russian forces, and neither by White Russian forces that remain. This conflict, known as the Ukrainian Soviet War, was part of the ongoing Russian Civil War and a struggle for national independence, which ended with the Ukrainian People's Republic being annexed into the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic, Western Ukraine being absorbed into the Second Polish Republic, and the newly stable Ukraine becoming a founding member of the Soviet Union. This government of the Soviet Ukrainian Republic was founded on December 24, 1917. In its publications it names itself either the Republic of Soviets of Workers, Soldiers, and Peasants Deputies or the Ukrainian People's Republic of Soviets. Quote, however, that republic was only recognized by another non-recognized country, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, and with the signing of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty was ultimately defeated by mid-1918 and eventually dissolved. The last session of the government took place in the city of Taganrog. In July 1918, the former members of the government formed the Communist Party of Ukraine, the Constituent Assembly of which took place in Moscow. With the defeat of the Central Powers in World War I, Bolshevik Russia resumed its hostilities towards the Ukrainian People's Republic, fighting for Ukrainian independence, and organized another Soviet government in Kursk, Russia, on March 10, 1919. According to the Third Congress of Soviets in Ukraine, the name of the state was changed to the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic, after the ratification of the 1936 Soviet Constitution. The names of all Soviet republics were changed, transposing the second and third words. In accordance, on December 5, 1936, the 8th Extraordinary Congress Soviets in Soviet Union changed the name of the republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which was ratified by the 14th Extraordinary Congress of Soviets in Ukrainian SSR on January 31, 1937. On August 24, 1991, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was legally renamed to the Republic of Ukraine and continues to do so to this very day. History. Founding. 1917 to 1922. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, several factions sought to create an independent Ukrainian state, alternately cooperating and struggling against each other. Numerous more or less socialist-oriented factions participated in the formation of the Ukrainian National Republic, among which were Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, Socialists, Revolutionaries, and many others. The most popular faction was initially the local Socialist Revolutionary Party that composed the local government together with Federalists and Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks boycotted any government initiatives most of the time, instigating several armed riots in order to establish the Soviet power without any intent for consensus. Immediately after the October Revolution in Petrograd, Bolsheviks instigated the Kiev Bolshevik uprising to support the revolution and secure Kiev. Due to a lack of adequate support from the local population and anti-revolutionary Central Rada, however, the Kiev Bolshevik group split. Most moved to Kharkov and received the support of the eastern Ukrainian cities and industrial centers. Later, this move was regarded as a mistake by some of the People's Commissars. They issued an ultimatum to the Central Rada on the 17th of December to recognize the Soviet regime, of which the Rada was very critical. The Bolsheviks convened a separate Congress and declared the First Soviet Republic of Ukraine on the 24th of December 1917, claiming the Central Rada and its supporters outlaws that need to be eradicated. Warfare ensued against the Ukrainian National Republic for the installation of the Soviet regime in the country, and with the direct support from Soviet Russia, the Ukrainian national forces were practically overrun. The government of Ukraine appealed to foreign capitalists, finding their support in the face of the Central Powers as the others refused to recognize it. After the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the Russian SSR yielded all the captured Ukrainian territory as the Bolsheviks were forced out of Ukraine. The government of the Soviet Ukraine was dissolved after its last session on the 20th of November 1918. After retaking Kharkov in February 1919, a second Soviet-Ukrainian government was formed, consisting mostly of Russians, Jews, and non-Ukrainians. The government enforced Russian policies that did not adhere to local needs. 3,000 workers were dispatched from Russia to take grain from local farms by force if necessary to feed Russian cities, and were met with resistance. The Ukrainian language was also censured from administrative and educational use, eventually fighting both white forces in the east and Republic forces in the west. Lenin ordered the liquidation of the Second Soviet-Ukrainian government in August 1919. Eventually, after the creation of the Communist Party of Ukraine in Moscow, a third Ukrainian Soviet government was formed on the 21st of December 1919 that initiated new hostilities against Ukrainian nationalists as they lost their military support from the defeated Central Powers. Eventually, the Red Army ended up controlling much of the Ukrainian territory after the Polish-Soviet Peace of Riga, on 30 December 1922, along with the Russian, Belarusian, and Transcaucasian republics. The Ukrainian SSR was one of the founding members of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Interwar years, 1922 to 1939. In 1932, the aggressive agricultural policies of Joseph Stalin's regime resulted in one of the largest national catastrophes in the modern history for the Ukrainian nation. A man-made famine known as the Holodomor caused a direct loss of human life estimated between 2.6 million to 10 million. Some scholars and International Commission of Inquiry into the 1932–33 famine in Ukraine state that this was an act of genocide, while other scholars state that the catastrophe was caused by gross mismanagement and failure to collectivize on a voluntary basis. The General Assembly of the UN has stopped shy of recognizing Holodomor as genocide, calling it great tragedy as a compromise between tense positions of UK, USA, Russia and Ukraine on the matter, while many nations went on individually to accept it as such. Between 1934 and 1939, prominent representatives of Ukrainian culture were executed. World War II, 1939 to 1945. In September 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Poland and occupied Galician lands inhabited by Ukrainians, Poles and Jews to the territory of the Ukrainian SSR. In 1945, these lands were permanently annexed, and the Transcarpathia region was added as well, by treaty with the post-war administration of Czechoslovakia. Following eastward Soviet retreat in 1941, Ufa became the wartime seat of the Soviet Ukrainian government. Post-war years. While World War II did not end before May 1945, the Germans were driven out of Ukraine between February 1943 and October 1944. The first task of the Soviet authorities was to re-establish political control over the republic, which had been entirely lost during the war. This was an immense task, considering the widespread human and material losses. During World War II, the Soviet Union lost around 11 million combatants and around 7 million civilians. Of these, 4.1 million and 1.4 were Ukrainian civilians and military personnel. Also, an estimated 3.9 million Ukrainians were evacuated to the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic during the war, and 2.2 million Ukrainians were sent to forced labor camps by the Germans. The material devastation was huge. Adolf Hitler's orders to create a zone of annihilation in 1943, coupled with the Soviet military's scorched earth policy in 1941, meant Ukraine lay in ruins. These two policies led to the destruction of 28,000 villages and 714 cities and towns. 85% of Kiev's city center was destroyed, as was 70% of the city center of the second largest city in Ukraine, Kharkov. Because of this, 19 million people were left homeless after the war. The Republic's industrial base, as so much else, was destroyed. The Soviet government had managed to evacuate 544 industrial enterprises between July and November 1941. But the rapid German advance led to the partial destruction of 16,150 enterprises, 27,900 and 10,000 collective farms, 1,300 machine tractor stations and 872 state farms were destroyed by the Germans. While the war brought to Ukraine an enormous physical destruction, victory also led to territorial expansion. As a victor, the Soviet Union gained new prestige and more land. The Ukrainian border was expanded to the Curzon Line. Ukraine was also expanded southwards, near the area Izmail, previously part of Romania. An agreement was signed by the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia whereby Carpathian Ruthenia was handed over to Ukraine. The territory of Ukraine expanded by 64,500 square miles and increased its population with an estimated 11 million. After World War II, amendments to the constitution of the Ukrainian SSR were accepted, which allowed it to act as a separate subject of international law in some cases and to a certain extent, remaining a part of the Soviet Union at the same time. In particular, these amendments allowed the Ukrainian SSR to become one of founding members of the United Nations together with the Soviet Union and the Belarusian SSR. This was part of a deal with the United States to ensure a degree of balance in the General Assembly, which the USSR opined was unbalanced in favor of the Western Bloc. In its capacity as a member of the UN, the Ukrainian SSR was an elected member of the United Nations Security Council in 1948, 1949 and 1984, 1985. Khrushchev and Brezhnev. When Stalin died on 5 March 1953, a collective leadership led by Khrushchev, Georgy Malenkov, Vyacheslav Molotov and Lavrentiy Beria took power, and a period of de-Stalinization took place. Change came as early as 1953, when officials were allowed to criticize Stalin's policy of Russification. The Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine openly criticized Stalin's Russification policies in a meeting in June 1953. On 4 June 1953, Oleksiy Kirichenko succeeded Leonid Melnikov as first secretary of the CPU. This was significant since Kirichenko was the first ethnic Ukrainian to lead the CPU since the 1920s. The policy of de-Stalinization took two main features, that of centralization and decentralization from the center. In February 1954, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic transferred Crimea as a gift to Ukraine from the Russians, even if only 22% of the Crimean population were ethnic Ukrainian. 1954 also witnessed the massive state-organized celebration of the 300th anniversary of the Treaty of Pereyaslav, the treaty which brought Ukraine under Russian rule 3 centuries before. The event was celebrated to prove the olden brotherly love between Ukrainians and Russians, and proof of the Soviet Union as a family of nations. It was also another way of legitimizing Marxism-Leninism. The policy of deliberate liberalization was characterized by 4 points. Amnesty for all those convicted of state crime during the war of the immediate post-war years. Amnesties for 1/3 of those convicted of state crime during Stalin's rule. The establishment of the first Ukrainian mission to the United Nations in 1958, and the steady increase of Ukrainians in the rank of the CPU and government of the Ukrainian SSR. Not only were the majority of CPU Central Committee and Politburo members ethnic Ukrainians, 3/4 of the highest-ranking party and state officials were ethnic Ukrainians too. The policy of partial Ukrainization also led to a cultural thaw within Ukraine. In October 1964, Khrushchev was deposed by a joint Central Committee and Politburo plenum and succeeded by another collective leadership, this time led by Leonid Brezhnev, born in Ukraine, as first secretary and Alexei Kosygin as chairman of the Council of Ministers. Brezhnev's rule would be marked by social and economic stagnation, a period often referred to as the era of stagnation. The new regime introduced the policy of ratified, which was the policy of uniting the different Soviet nationalities into one Soviet nationality by merging the best elements of each nationality into the new one. This policy turned out to be, in fact, the reintroduction of the Russification policy. The reintroduction of this policy can be explained by Khrushchev's promise of communism in 20 years. The unification of Soviet nationalities would take place, according to Vladimir Lenin, when the Soviet Union reached the final stage of communism, also the final stage of human development. Some all-Union Soviet officials were calling for the abolition of the pseudo-sovereign Soviet republics, and the establishment of one nationality, instead of introducing the ideologic concept of the Soviet nation. Brezhnev at the 24th Party Congress talked about a new historical community of people, the Soviet people, and introduced the ideological tenet of developed socialism, which postponed communism. When Brezhnev died in 1982, he was succeeded by Yuri Andropov, who died quickly after taking power. Andropov was succeeded by Konstantin Chernenko, who ruled for little more than a year. Chernenko was succeeded by Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985. Gorbachev and dissolution, 1985 to 1991. Gorbachev's policies of perestroika and glasnost failed to reach Ukraine as early as other Soviet republics because of Volodymyr Shabitsky, a conservative communist appointed by Brezhnev and the first secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party, who resigned from his post in 1989. The Chernobyl disaster of 1986, the Russification policies, and the apparent social and economic stagnation led several Ukrainians to oppose Soviet rule. Gorbachev's policy of perestroika was also never introduced into practice. 95% of industry and agriculture was still owned by the Soviet state in 1990. The talk of reform, but the lack of introducing reform into practice, led to confusion which in turn evolved into opposition to the Soviet state itself. The policy of glasnost, which ended state censorship, led the Ukrainian diaspora to reconnect with the compatriots in Ukraine. The revitalization of religious practices by destroying the monopoly of the Russian Orthodox Church and led to the establishment of several opposition pamphlets, journals and newspapers. Following the failed August coup in Moscow on August 19–21, 1991, the Supreme Soviet of the Ukrainian SSR declared independence on the 24th of August 1991, which renamed the Ukrainian SSR to the Republic of Ukraine. The result of the 1991 independence referendum held on the 1st of December 1991 proved to be a surprise. An overwhelming majority, 92.3%, voted for independence. The referendum carried in the majority of all oblasts. Notably, the Crimea, which had originally been a territory of the RSFSR until 1954, supported the referendum by a 54% majority. Over 80% of the population of eastern Ukraine voted for independence. Ukraine's independence from the Soviet Union led to an almost immediate recognition from the international community. Ukraine's newfound independence was the first time in the 20th century that Ukrainian independence had not been attempted without either foreign intervention or civil war. In the 1991 Ukrainian presidential election, 62% of Ukrainians voted for Leonid Kravchuk. The secession of the second most powerful republic in the Soviet Union ended any realistic chance of the Soviet Union staying together even on a limited scale. The The Soviet Union formally dissolved 3 weeks after Ukraine's secession. Ukraine is the legal successor to the Ukrainian SSR, who has refused to recognize exclusive Russian claims to succession of the Soviet Union and claimed such status for Ukraine as well, which was stated in Articles 7 and 8 of On Legal Succession of Ukraine, issued in 1991. Following independence, Ukraine has continued to pursue claims against the Russian Federation in foreign courts, seeking to recover its share of the foreign property that was owned by the Soviet Union. It also retained its seat in the United Nations, held since 1945. Politics and government. The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic's system of government was based on a one-party communist system ruled by the Communist Party of Ukraine, a part of the Communist Party of Soviet Union. The republic was one of 15 constituent republics composing the Soviet Union from its entry into the Union in 1922 till its dissolution in 1991. All of the political power and authority in the USSR was in the hands of Communist Party authorities, with little real power being concentrated in official government bodies and organs. In such a system, lower-level authorities directly reported to higher-level authorities and so on, with the bulk of the power being held at the highest echelons of the Communist Party. Originally, the legislative authority was vested in the Central Executive Committee of Ukraine that for many years was headed by Grigory Petrovsky. Soon after publishing the Stalin Constitution, the Central Executive Committee was transformed into the Supreme Soviet, which consisted of 450 deputies. The Supreme Soviet had the authority to enact legislation, amend the constitution, adopt new administrative and territorial boundaries, adopt the budget, and establish political and economic development plans. In addition, Parliament also had authority to elect the Republic's executive branch, the Council of Ministers, as well as the power to appoint judges to the Supreme Court. Legislative sessions were short and were conducted for only a few weeks out of the year. In spite of this, the Supreme Soviet elected the Presidium, the chairman, 3 deputy chairmen, a secretary, and a couple of other government members to carry out the official functions and duties in between legislative sessions. The Presidium was a powerful position in the Republic's higher echelons of power, and could nominally be considered the equivalent of head of state. Although most executive authority would be concentrated in the Communist Party's Politburo and its first secretary, full universal suffrage was granted for all eligible citizens aged 18 and over, excluding prisoners and those deprived of freedom. Although they could not be considered free and were of a symbolic nature, elections to the Supreme Soviet were contested every 5 years. Nominees from electoral districts from around the Republic, typically consisting of an average of 110,000 inhabitants, were directly chosen by party authorities, providing little opportunity for political change, since all political authority was directly subordinate to the higher level above it. With the beginning of Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika reforms towards the mid-late 1980s, electoral reform laws were passed in 1989, liberalizing the nominating procedures and allowing multiple candidates to stand for election in a district. Accordingly, the first relatively free elections in the Ukrainian SSR were contested in March 1990. 111 deputies from the Democratic Bloc, a loose association of small pro-Ukrainian and pro-sovereignty parties, and the Instrumental People's Movement of Ukraine were elected to the parliament, although the Communist Party retained its majority with 331 deputies. Large support for the Democratic Bloc demonstrated the people's distrust of the communist authorities, which would eventually boil down to Ukrainian independence in 1991. On the international front, the Ukrainian SSR, along with the rest of the 15 republics, virtually had no say in their own foreign affairs. It is, however, important to note that in 1944 the Ukrainian SSR was permitted to establish bilateral relations with countries and maintain its own standing army. This clause was used to permit the republic's membership in the United Nations. Accordingly, representatives from the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and 50 other nations founded the UN on October 24, 1945. In effect, this provided the Soviet Union with another vote in the General Assembly. The latter aspect of the 1944 clauses, however, was never fulfilled, and the Republic's defense matters were managed by the Soviet Armed Forces and the Defense Ministry. Another right that was granted but never used until 1991 was the right of the Soviet republics to secede from the Union, which was codified in each of the Soviet constitutions. Accordingly, Article 69 of the Constitution of the Ukrainian SSR stated, "The Ukrainian SSR retains the right to willfully secede from the USSR." Quote, however, a republic's theoretical secession from the Union was virtually impossible and unrealistic in many ways until after Gorbachev's perestroika reforms. Ukraine is the legal successor of the Ukrainian SSR, and it's stated to fulfill those rights and duties pursuant to international agreements of Union SSR which do not contradict the Constitution of Ukraine and interests of the Republic. On the 5th of October 1991, after Ukrainian independence, the Ukrainian SSR's parliament was changed from Supreme Soviet to its current name Verkhovna Rada. The Verkhovna Rada is still Ukraine's parliament.